Welcome, guys, to the Macros Bodybuilding and Powerlifting podcast. I'm your host, Steve Hall, and I have another excellent guest for you this week with Bryce Lewis. So I first heard of Bryce, or kind of found Bryce, through probably 3D Muscle Journey, Eric Helms, and Matt Ogus. Bryce was kind of featured on his channel, I know, a few times. I don't particularly follow YouTube and Matt Ogus a lot now, but in the past there was kind of mobility work and things like that, which I found incredibly helpful. And I know Bryce is kind of massively a giver, and he has his own kind of way of giving information now. Lots of people know about him, and you hopefully have heard of The Strength Athlete. So that's Bryce's main kind of coaching platform at the moment, and that's all powerlifting. So I know you've coached, I think this is old information, but over 500 different athletes, which is fantastic. And I know like you would have helped thousands by now, because I've personally downloaded your kind of the intermediate training program on the website just to look over the programming and learn for myself, which is fantastic. And I definitely recommend other people do the same. And apart from that, I know you used to do volleyball to a high level. You also competed in bodybuilding at one point, which is kind of interesting to the listeners who are into bodybuilding and powerlifting, just like myself. But now fully into powerlifting and a highly successful powerlifter. So I'll have to read these off so the listeners know, because I'll get them wrong otherwise. So you've got several USPL and IPF records to your name, and you're the current national champion for the 105 kilogram class in the USPL. And you're going to be competing in the IPF Worlds in Belarus shortly, which we'll get into. And I know also I like to add a little bit of context to these things, because obviously you're a coach, you're an athlete, like powerlifting is kind of your day-to-day, but you have, I believe, actually a wife, you're married. Is that right? I don't want to get that wrong. Yeah, you are married.
Yeah, I am.
I was just
We've
thinking,
been married a little over 3 years now.
Yeah, so I don't want to put you in the kind of in the shitter, say you're married, and then you should be, if she listens in, it's like, now I expect a proposal. So I knew were
we're
long
definitely
term.
married.
And you've got dogs, but not a full on family yet. So you're not just, and I know you like kind of your food, very much into cooking and stuff. See that come on Instagram and stuff. So people know there's more to Bryce than just powerlifting. So is anything you want to add to that, Bryce?
Well, thank you for the warm introduction. That's fantastic. Yeah, powerlifting has become a lot of my life lately, both in terms of competing and training as an athlete, coaching other athletes, and then running the Strength Athlete, where I get to work with 4 other fantastic coaches helping athletes around the world. So that takes care of most of the things. Outside of that, you mentioned a few hobbies and some drawing in there as well, and getting outdoors every now and then, photography and so on. But yeah, awesome. Lifting, lots of lifting.
And that is what we're going to be talking about. So I just touched on your preparation for Belarus, and just want to kind of hear how is that going? How's your preparation going? Have you achieved any good kind of lifts recently? How are you feeling for it?
Yeah, so I was lucky enough to just edge out the other competitors and get a spot on the team headed to Belarus. So I'm really excited for that, and just getting to compete there this year is the prize, and just being able to get to that next level and see how competing at the world level is even like. Mm-hmm. So training has been, for the most part, good. Bench press feels great. About 2 weeks ago, I did something to my left glute, and it's been feeling kind of funky. So training loads have taken a little bit of a hit on squatting and deadlifting. They just don't feel as comfortable in the setup and execution of the lift. So I'm working with a PT and just doing some work on my own to see if I can improve that over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess that's the worst thing for you, is to potentially be injured going into the competition. So you'll do everything you can now while you've got the time to make maneuvers around that. And I know you know a lot about kind of physiotherapy, well, not physiotherapy necessarily, but those sort of mobility drills and that. Do you think that's been kind of pivotal to your progression over the last few years?
No. I've actually been increasingly skeptical of physical therapy practices as time goes on. So Does that serve me better? Possibly, in the fact that I'm avoiding things that don't really have much of an effect. But honestly, I think there's a lot of effect in placebo, and I wish that I still believed in some things more, because maybe they actually would have caused some positive effect in terms of increased recovery or something like that.
No, definitely. I think that's a great point. I know I personally follow Quinn Hennock a fair amount, and he's bringing out information that's fantastic. Whereas I know my kind of the golden boy was I've forgotten, supple leopard, and I used to use a lot of those methods.
Yeah.
So it's
the problem for me right now is, like, I need help. I need some physical therapy, but like, I only know things that are not effective. I don't know things that are effective. Like self-myofascial release may, be slightly beneficial at increasing range of motion, but the amount of force required to cause structural changes in tissue is more than what we can apply, and you would just break the muscle apart. Similar claims can be made against dry needling and hot and cold treatment and chiropractic and all of these other things. So I'm left not knowing what it actually works.
Yeah, it's hard. It's almost sometimes the more you know, the more you wish you didn't know. Kind of ignorance is bliss sometimes, for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
And actually, I mean, because we've kind of ruled out, obviously, I mean, mobility, I think a lot of people would have realized that wasn't going to be the thing that's made a tremendous difference to your results. But over the last 2 years, you were a good lifter. And actually, I was talking to this just today. I have, Lawrence Farncombe, I believe you've spoken to him before. He's the head Great British coach, and he is actually he trains out of my gym, so I'm in quite close contact with him, and he's been on the podcast before, and he's kind of a great guy. And I told him about you were coming on today, and he was touching on kind of what am I going to ask about, and I was going to ask, well, how over the last 2 years have you gone? And he was like, how you shot up out of nowhere, almost seemingly, over the last 2 years. You were a very good lifter, and then you were kind of like, right in his eyes, as a very standout competitive lifter. And what if we just touch on a few things? What do you think? What's changed over the last 2 years, or what's made the difference, do you believe, to get you to where you are right now, which is like in a fantastic position?
Right. So my last meet as a 93 kilo lifter was nationals in October of 2014, and it wasn't a short diet to get down to the 93 kilo lifting class. I didn't have to do a whole lot of water manipulation, but I did have to do a lot of calorie restriction to get there. And as a result, performance dropped, and it's been kind of consistently that way, that in the 93 kilo class, performance just hasn't been up to where training lifts had been. And obviously because I'd been training heavier and then dieting down to competition and, expecting a high level of performance, and it just wasn't there. So we decided at that point to just compete at whatever body weight that I landed at, which ended up being around the middle between the 93 and 105 kilo weight classes, and just slowly worked my way up. So I won't say that it's all increased body weight, but it made a massive difference just not dieting for competition, first off, so that you get higher levels of in-competition performance. And also the calorie surplus, the lack of stress in life generally. We also made a move from 4 days of training to 5 days of training per week, which spread fatigue possibly a little bit better, allowing for more recovery, better attention to the movements that I was doing. So those were the big things. Technique changed a little bit. So I switched from conventional deadlifting to sumo deadlifting. And I think that the increased efficiency at sumo, the fact that it didn't take as much of a toll on overall physiological recovery, probably went a ways on the deadlift. But yeah, the combination of those things probably increased performance quite a bit.
And you talked about, you touched on have you changed? I'm assuming that means you're coached, I believe, by Eric Helms at the moment. Did you change coaches? Say always Eric, or?
Yes, so Eric has been my powerlifting coach from the very start. I've been lucky enough to be able to build a good relationship with him. He knows me, better over time. We've been able to kind of find patterns and find what works, and just more so, he's been able to talk me off the ledge when things freak out or I have a bad training session or something like that. And that's been invaluable.
Amazing.
Like programming aside, the emotional support when I need it is probably the biggest thing that I benefit from coaching. So yeah, it's been Eric Helms for just about 7 years now since I started powerlifting, and then 1 year of bodybuilding before that.
Wow. So yeah, you must have a very good relationship with him, and the listeners will know who Eric Helms is because he's been on the podcast. I mean, he is almost like the token everyone thinks of Eric Helms when they think of bodybuilding and powerlifting. So he's obviously a brilliant guy, and it is interesting to hear technique changed a little bit. And I guess for a lot of people, sumo is, if you can do it effectively, it is a more efficient lift, and like you can almost do more of it. Like you were saying, it's not as kind of physiologically and psychologically in many ways as tiring, so you can get more volume with it, I presume. And then also, I guess the 5 days split has allowed you to get out more volume potentially, so through your programming, and kind of more effective volume potentially. In many ways, it doesn't sound like anything drastic really changed, apart from maybe the biggest thing that it sounds like was the body weight kind of just and the stress that I guess the dieting brought, and having to get into that body weight category. And I know you've spoken about it before, in that you see a lot of lifters kind of hold on to certain weight categories and they really diet down for it rather than let their body weight settle where they feel kind of best. And I guess this is similar, and people can relate it to bodybuilding in that people talk about kind of staying lean to try and kind of potentiate more muscle mass growth. But if you don't feel good, then that's never going to be good for your lifts, for your training, which is always the most important thing when it comes to powerlifting and bodybuilding.
Yeah, that's right. I think for high level lifters, you can talk about getting down to a specific weight class because you're the most competitive there. Yeah. But the message that I try to put out there is that the majority of lifters, the weight classes are just arbitrary numbers. You're not looking for national records or something like that, and just continuing to improve your own performance. So kind of measuring you versus you over time is going to be the best way, and to really just disregard the weight classes for quite a while. Mm-hmm. I've seen the best progress in athletes when that's the case, and it really just, 63 kilos or 74, 83 or 93, like those are somewhat arbitrary numbers, considering here in the US, there's 198 pounds, 181, kind of the older American weight classes. And so it's best to focus on what body weight can I get my best performance at, mm-hmm. instead of trying to force yourself into a weight class that you may not belong in.
Mm-hmm. No, I definitely see that. And I think especially younger lifters would really, really benefit from listening to that. And I think something else I guess would be interesting to me is if someone was competitive at maybe a lower body weight, I guess the way I view things, probably dieting beforehand, getting that weight off beforehand, so then you can come into the meets in a non-dieted state is probably a good way to go. I guess you've really benefited from that nutritional kind of having plenty of carbs, plenty of just energy, just overflowing with that. Do you think that played quite a big role for yourself?
I do. I go back and forth, by the way, Steve, on the issue of how best to make a weight class.
Okay.
If you're that high level athlete, preparing for a competition and you're over your competitive weight class, trying to get down to the top, I go back and forth. Weight cuts can be very effective, and I'm talking water and substrate manipulation up to, let's say 3% body weight, which for a lot of people is exactly what they're trying to cut. Let's pretend someone's a 93 kilo lifter. If they're 95, 96, that's an easy thing to do with water manipulation. And the benefit there is that you get to stay in a caloric maintenance period, basically all the way up into the competition without needing a deficit. On the other hand, part of me says, let's not roll the dice right before a competition with a water cut. Let's get a calorie deficit in much earlier on. Let's get you exactly 2 or even a half a kilo below your competitive weight class. give you some room so that stress is as low as possible by the time you actually approach. And maybe we have enough room to increase calories up into the competition. Speaking from a bodybuilding standpoint, that would be ideal anyways, because you increase glycogen in muscle tissue and you look better. But from a performance standpoint, I think we're looking at something similar too. Increasing calories into the competition is ideal. Being able to have a large meal the night before, being able to put the stress out of your mind of needing to be a specific body weight because, hey, you already are. So I go back and forth on which of those is ideal. The weight cut method for manipulating water, if you're within 3%, I don't think it's going to have a negative effect on performance outside of any leverage issues. If you're a little bit lighter, your belt is going to fit a little bit different. You might have a slightly different forward lean in your squat and your deadlift. And on bench press, your diameter is a little bit smaller all the way around. So you're going to be pressing the bar with a slightly longer range of motion. Yeah. That's going to happen, though, regardless of how you diet down to your weight class. So really now we're just talking about, do we want to do it by calorie deficit or do we want to do it by water? And ultimately, I think it's on a case-by-case basis. Yeah. For some people, it's super easy to use water manipulation. It doesn't seem to have an emotional toll or a physical toll. They can do it no problem. And for other people, it really is kind of a roll of the dice.
Mm-hmm. No, that's super interesting. And I'm glad you kind of drew on the bodybuilding aspect, because I was thinking about like peaking and how kind of there's different approaches that people take. And I definitely think the stress, like you said, and that will be individual to people. I guess people who've never tried it before, it might be very stressful. But people who are kind of experienced with it and have done it like time and time again, it'll be kind of quite easy. Do you ever kind of, as people, speaking of bodybuilding and people do like practice peak weeks, do you ever do like mock meets where you do try and do the water cuts and actually practice that sort of thing? Have you ever done that yourself?
Yeah, for some athletes, if there's a large competition on the horizon and it's our first time cutting weight to make it, it's effective to practice that, both in terms of having the athlete go through the process of what this is going to be like, and secondarily to figure out, okay, well, how much weight can we lose via this method, so that we know, okay, well, if we can only lose a kilo using water manipulation, you're going to have to be 94 kilos before we start this, or you're never going to make it. So it does serve to get some additional information, and at pretty low cost too. All we're doing is fluid manipulation, really.
Cool. No, I think that's a good point, and I think, yeah, just people need to know themselves and to try things out for themselves. And I think for a lot of people who are listening to this, who will be kind of not the super competitive and everything, they're probably better off, and especially if they're thinking of doing like their first or second powerlifting meet, is just to roll into their weight class, not think about water cutting and all these things, and just kind of get numbers on the table.
Yeah, exactly. There's enough to be focused on at your first few competitions to not have to worry about that at all. I mean, you've got commands, you've got the first time probably performing in front of an audience. So you have to deal with that and to deal with the exacting specifications of the federation you decide to compete in, and not to mention trying to put up your best performance ever. Mm-hmm. So why throw another wrench into the works if it's absolutely not necessary?
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And just to touch briefly on, you talked about your training frequency changing from 4 times a week to 5 times a week. Did your frequency of the lifts change on that as well? I guess you spread them out over further days. And the individual lifts, I know you were recently talking to Mike Teixeira on his podcast, and you spoke about how your differences in kind of deadlift frequency were there. And has that changed for you? And with your athletes, how kind of does that look across the board?
That's a great question. For me, we took the same lift frequency and just spread it over an extra day. Cool. The idea was I wanted to train more frequently but less time per training session so I could get back to work. It was kind of a logistical consideration. Mm-hmm. And it happened to also spread fatigue a little bit better. So for me, we didn't change lift frequency at all. In other athletes, deciding on lift frequency usually has to do with figuring out when they come to you, where do they start off? And if they started off somewhere reasonable, then you can pick up there. If they started off somewhere unreasonable, both in terms of too little or too much, you can kind of correct to somewhere in a middle range, and then just slowly increase frequency as you go up. For the athletes that I work with, I don't have anyone squatting more than 4 times per week, benching more than 5 times per week, and deadlifting more than twice, with a deadlift variation sometimes is a 2.5. And that's spread over at most 6 days.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah, because I know like Mike himself quite likes the higher frequency, and there's been quite a lot of kind of, well, not a lot, but there's been some small amount of research kind of coming out within the higher frequency powerlifting, but it's definitely in its kind of early stages. So it's interesting to hear how kind of you kept yours the same and seen better results just by spreading that. And I think a lot of the time when we do look at kind of the frequency, it has become just a way of spreading volume. And as you get more advanced, I guess you find value in spreading it more, and that's essentially what you did in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And again, there's so much individuality here. So for instance, a lot of athletes have benefit by consolidating lower training volume or lower body training volume into a few sessions. So doing squat and deadlift on one day and squat and deadlift again on another day, so that there is more time in between times where you've trained the lower body, so that you have kind of quote unquote full rest. Whereas I like to do kind of a little bit, squatting on one day, deadlifting on another, squatting on another, and so on. So it's just different ways of splitting up the same training. Back to the frequency thing. The research on higher frequency to me seems pretty convincing, with the caveat that these are theoretical models and you run up against real world limits. Like, hey, I can't go into the gym 6 days a week. Sorry. So even if in theory it seems like a good idea, in practice, we need to make sure what training approach is going to allow you to do this for 3 years, 4 years, 10 years into your future without getting burnout.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, would it be anything you'd consider periodizing at times? Like, I know the squat every day, like there's been quite good kind of use of that and people have seen good results with it, but it's not something you'd keep all the time. Have you ever manipulated things like that? Or do you find actually keeping things relatively simple and the same, actually you see better stuff happening?
Yeah, one thing I haven't really played around with a whole lot is shock mesocycles, or periods where you heavily adjust frequency and then kind of dial it back. So, the Smolov base cycle, Shaiko has a few kind of very high volume, very short duration periods of time. I haven't played around with a whole lot of that, but I can see how those would be used during the year. If I have an athlete who's making a lot of success, we'll definitely ride that wave and just continue adding intensity. But I haven't played around with large bumps in frequency for the sake of additional short bursts of progress.
Cool. Okay. No, that's fine. And I mean, you keep to what works for the most part, and kind of you're keeping on the science and you're keeping up to date with stuff. So I think that's enough. And you obviously update your views and update things anyway. So no, it's really interesting to hear. And I think the next question I wanted to get onto, and we might have talked about it a little bit already with some of the kind of psychological and stress aspects, but you're surrounded by kind of some of the top lifters. I mean, you are one of the top lifters and you're surrounded by those as well. And you're surrounded by, and you coach a lot of kind of very good, decent lifters. Do you see any kind of big differences between those people? Is there a reason that some people are top lifters, other people aren't? Is it kind of, what does that come down to for the most part, do you see?
That's a fantastic question. And it's one that science in general for a long time has been trying to answer. What makes someone a high level lifter and someone not? And there's going to be just a mix of a ton of different factors, and we can go over a lot of those. So for instance, on the physiological side and psychological, but on the physiological side, you've got individual differences in how athletes respond to the same training stimulus. So in terms of like bang for buck, 3 sets of 8 or something like that can elicit a certain training stimulus in one athlete and can elicit 3 times that same training stimulus in another athlete. There are changes in recoverability, so how much recovery time you need in between specific training sessions. Like I said, differences in how you respond, so the growth per unit of work. And then on the psychological side, differences in attributional style. So if you achieve success, how do you attribute that success? Is it things that you did, or did you just get lucky? How do you describe your success? And generally, those differences can be somewhat predictive of the high levels of performance, and it can be different in terms of if you succeeded or failed. So let me pull up some notes that I had here from this very conversation.
Awesome.
So in terms of attributional style, there was a study by Buchanan and Seligman in 95. So how do optimists who generally do better in terms of performance as athletes, how do they explain positive events? So they explain positive events as internal, so it's something that was within your control to do, as stable, so that the reason for your success will always be there. And as global, that my reason for success here is the same as my reason for success in other things.
Cool.
When it comes to negative events, they describe the failure as external. So it was something that they couldn't control. So they shift the burden of blame. As unstable. So the reason is only temporary. Maybe I had a bad performance in this powerlifting competition because I had to fly out, and compete in a place that I don't normally do. But that's unstable. It might not be the case in a future competition. That's good because it makes it so that I have room for improvement and that I am not myself a failure. And it's specific. It applies to only this one circumstance. So attributional style can keep an athlete positive, or it can keep an athlete negative in terms of how they view their successes and failures.
That's really cool. Do you ever kind of use that as a coaching tool with your athletes? Kind of, do you refer back to that and try and get them to kind of more towards that sort of way of thinking?
If you find athletes that are more pessimist in terms of their explanatory style, you can give them some strategies to think outside that, so that they don't internalize a training failure to I am a failure. And that's a big thing, we're all going to come up against hard sessions where we underperform, below a specific goal. If you view that as I failed, that's fine. But if you view that as I am a failure, that's a difference, because it's going to prevent future successes. So if they're open with you in terms of communication, you can head off some of those things and give them tools to kind of frame things in a different way.
No, I think that's brilliant. Yeah, the framing, and I've heard about framing before, or I think that is something that's kind of a psychological thing with the framing and putting things into a good perspective. Because I certainly have lifters who do get discouraged sometimes about their performance, and I find myself actually, without thinking about what you've just talked about here, definitely trying to kind of reason with them and try and show them progress where they have made it, and normally there is an explanation that is outside of their control, and that's really interesting. And for yourself, I guess having a coach through Eric who knows you, he, I guess, has helped with this. He's kept you kind of stable.
Yeah, definitely. The thing that helps most with there's a few things, but having an outside perspective is probably the biggest thing. So when you're training, you are in the day-to-day of things, and it's very hard to see the larger picture, or to realize that, yes, things might be tough right now, but that's by design, and things will get easier going forward, or, hey, you're supposed to feel this way right now. So all those kind of like meta thoughts, it's really good to have an outside perspective for. And over time, I've actually used Eric less and less frequently. So our check-ins now are every 4 weeks or 3 weeks or something like that. They're not on a weekly basis.
No, that's really good. And I guess that shows how you can use a coach and kind of then just have them as a kind of as and when you need them to keep you on the right path. But it certainly shows the benefits of having not just kind of, and this is completely out of programming and kind of training and nutrition. This is psychological, and this is something that you can't kind of get from just a cookie cutter training program or anything, even a custom design program. You need a coach that can actually talk you through things, and just having that experience has then allowed you, and I'm sure it's influenced your own coaching and helped you improve your own coaching.
Yeah. It's my dream that one day we'll be able to get TSA to the point where we can cover kind of all of the basis of what sport coaching should be. We do nutritional adjustments, training and programming, kind of forecasting, off-season training, on-season training, strategy, technique, all that kind of stuff. But there are still some things that I feel that we have to outsource, and it would be really cool to keep all of that stuff in-house. In the same way that professional sports teams have a whole staff of people to work at the athlete's disposal. Yeah. Obviously we're not working directly with all professional athletes, but I still want to be able to provide them that. So it would be cool to have a sports psychologist, a physical therapist, someone who is a registered dietitian, and just kind of bring in more resources so that the athletes are able to kind of develop from all these angles.
No, it's really that actually I've never really thought about that, because I'm an online coach as well, and I find myself kind of saying, for some aspects it's out of my scope of practice and things, and it would be really nice because you want to help every client you've got in the best way possible. But sometimes I've definitely had probably more so the psychological side where I feel like I am almost becoming a psychiatrist, but I'm not qualified for that, and I feel like that's where I need to refer them out, or at least recommend them to be kind of seeing someone else. I think it'll probably help me as well, seeing kind of how they interact with that person.
Yeah, exactly. And one benefit of keeping everything in-house is you kind of all get to share information on this athlete, and you all have this athlete's best interest in mind, and you get to develop them as they go forward. I do think some of the sports psychology stuff, I hope, takes a larger role, because I've just seen how much it affects performance,
And that's actually really cool how that's kind of led on to the next question, because I know, and I watched, I think it was the Powerlifting University, you did a talk on psychology, and I thought that was really interesting. I think there was an element of where you talked about kind of what happens today, whether it might be like your body weight on the scale, your lift progress, whatever it might be, you're always looking back at what it could be. You never actually know what has led to that. I don't know if you want to kind of talk to this at all, or if you want to expand about kind of the importance and the role of psychology for kind of progress in athletes.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things. On the one hand, the hindsight bias is the idea that some event happens, and after the fact we create a reason why that event happened, even if we don't exactly know. And this happens in strength and conditioning all the time for N=1 cases, and that's why when you said like, hey, what happened to make your progress so great from 2014 to now, I can only guess, instead of insert reasons. And, ultimately that's going to be better. So when people have great training cycles, or when people have really shitty training cycles, we want to find a reason for that kind of stuff, because we're moral creatures and we're thinking, and we want to be able to understand the world around us, but we have to understand the limits of that type of thinking at least. In terms of motivation, we can talk about what motivates athletes. And I think self-determination theory has kind of a great framework for that. So it's like these three pillars of why we're motivated to do things, and it applies to sport pretty darn well. So relatedness, the degree to which we kind of relate to others around us, other people doing the same activity, so other athletes, other coaches, the degree to which we feel part of a community. Autonomy is the second one. So the idea that you have control over your destiny in this, that you are the author of your own actions. And then finally, competence, the idea that if I put in work, then I can succeed in this, that there's a relationship between effort and outcome. And so for a lot of people, when they're injured or training isn't going well, that sense of competence decreases, and so does motivation as a result.
No, I think that's actually fantastic when you're talking through those. I've heard of it, but when you talk through each aspect, and I do think of even myself and my clients, and that's definitely something, I think that's something a coach can really provide because, well, a coaching team and you've got other clients, I guess, then you're in kind of a group together, and like we can think to your TSA, you've got a group there, and so if like 3DMJ, it's a community where you're surrounded by like-minded individuals, and that can really kind of just help push you forward. It can keep you on track. And then, yeah, I guess you probably do this with your athletes in that it's not like your way or the highway. You have discussions over their training kind of programming. You give them some autonomy for like at least like training frequency and stuff like that. That's very important.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of ways to, especially in our sport, insert autonomy. RPE is one way.
Yeah.
Hey, you've got control over the load. You can say, hey, what type of movements do you want to do? What's fun to you? What does your schedule look like? Hey, here's the training approach I came up with. How does this look to you? So to kind of put them in the driver's seat more often.
Mm-hmm. And I think for coaches, that's important as well because it puts less pressure on you as the coach in a sense, because you don't know everything. You don't know the insides and outs of the athlete. And I know, actually, I think I can think of Jeff Alberts, who in some of his programs with some of his clients, he says like, use a row variant that kind of you feel good with. I'm not going to tell you exactly what row variant you have to do, but pick one that you feel good with. And I think in some ways people will think that's a cop-out, but in many ways it's just the truth. It's just we're not that person. We can't be in their body. And so having some control and having them realize why they're doing things is important as well, because if they don't know why they're doing it, then their probably belief systems aren't going to be there.
Yeah. And I can see the athlete who says, look, I hired you because I want you to choose the movement that I'm supposed to do. And we run across that too. But at that point, we have to kind of counter and say, there's no research on which row variant is going to be better than another, not to mention what equipment you have available to you and stuff like that. So we're taking care of the important things, and some things we're just going to give you some control on.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And to go a touch further with the kind of psychological aspects, when you are, I've watched, and you used to actually do it more frequently, your live videos on Facebook kind of your lifting and things like that. And it's really interesting watching different people lift in their environment and all of those sort of things. Do you at all use kind of visualization, or do you practice any kind of mental aspects before you lift, like on off days or even during training? How do you really kind of prepare yourself, especially for like lifts maybe that you've not done before, or maybe that kind of cause anxiety or anything like that?
The lifting environment can play a big role for me. So certain music can have a really soothing, kind of encouraging effect on me. Just a sense that I'm in control, like autonomy, and just regulating arousal level is huge for me. So for all athletes, there's going to be some range of arousal that you perform best in, and then too excitable / nervous ends up decreasing performance. Too calm also ends up decreasing performance. So there's kind of a Goldilocks range there that may be different for different athletes. If you take a look at Screamer, the 105 kilo lifter from the UK, he may be higher on the arousal curve than I may be, but it's still ideal for him. Whereas, mine is ideal for me. Mm-hmm. When I look back on the days where I have felt like I could have lifted the world, I'm somewhat calm, confident. There's no anxiety. There's a sense that I've been here before, and there's no fear. So removing the fear can be done by a bunch of different ways. But for me, almost smiling my way through it, and the music definitely helps a lot.
Yeah, I guess in many ways it's kind of knowing yourself is important, because there will be, I know, and I've done this myself, where I've got amped up for a lift, or like I've taken lots of caffeine and I've really got pumped up, and then I go for it and like my form's just completely atrocious. I'm
Yeah.
not I can't get jacked up for lifts. It just throws me off completely. Whereas I know, and you see this with like Lane Norton and people know of, and like Screamer Samuel, like they get amped up big time for lifts, and they nail it. And so I think, like you said, and I know Mike Schroeder's the same, and you need to keep calm for lifts. Because there's optimal arousal zone for everyone, and it's going to differ person to person. And I guess, do you find, is there ever a time where people attempt these lifts where they're not, like the neurological side in terms of training, do they ever, you see people go for lifts when they're just not even prepared for it? Because you talk to, like, you've been there before and you feel settled. Like when you're attempting something you've never tried before, is there anything that ever warrants you to worry or?
So powerlifting is relatively low risk from a standpoint of getting injured or anything like that. If you miss a squat, there are safety bars there, assuming you set yourself up well. If you miss a bench, same thing. If you miss a deadlift, you drop the barbell. So the risk of injury is somewhat low, very low compared to team sports and things where you're not moving perfectly bilaterally. So from an injury standpoint, there's not too much to worry about. But from a performance standpoint, am I going to make this or am I going to miss it? Yeah, you can convince yourself out of things that otherwise training says you should be very capable of. Mm-hmm. So, the last few weeks of progress says, hey, you'll be fine for this training load. And then when you get under the barbell, you can totally convince yourself out of that. And that's happened to me quite a handful of times.
Awesome. And then just finally, kind of want to talk about if you've got your eye on anything in particular at the moment in terms of kind of, is there anything that's caught your attention in terms of training tools or new research that's coming out that you're trying, different methods? Is there anything that's kind of taking your interest, or are you just kind of going with what you've got?
Yeah, so the bread and butter of training works very, very well. And I think a lot of people want to glamorize training into something more than is really necessary. So like, static number of sets, reps, and intensity is darn effective. Mm-hmm. Daily undulating periodization was talked about in a lot of detail a few years back, and then you don't really hear a whole lot about it right now, and people just kind of accept that this is a good way to train. But daily undulating periodization is darn cool, and it really makes a lot of progress. One of the other things lately is we're experimenting with potentiation from a heavier load.
Cool.
So the idea is do something for a low number of reps with a heavy load, and then afterwards back off to a larger number of reps for a lighter load. So the idea of like a top heavy set followed by quote unquote hypertrophy work afterwards.
Okay.
The idea there is by getting above some threshold intensity, we get to maximally recruit motor units that are quote unquote primed after that by the time you hit your hypertrophy work. The idea being that you'll end up with a larger amount of progress than you would without having done that top set work. Mm-hmm. So there is research on that in terms of sprinting, and not so much in terms of strength training just yet. But the energy systems for sprinting are similar. So that leaves me optimistic that something like this can be effective for strength training as well. We might do a study on that too, recruiting some volunteers and something like that. But we're doing it in my own training right now with a heavy walkout to increase confidence too. So it'll be a walkout with 85% or something like that, and then drop down to 75 for my working sets.
Mm-hmm. No, it's really interesting. I know I've heard of that, and I know I think there's actually a technical term for it, but yeah, where it turns on the kind of more muscle fibers because you're using heavier loads. Yeah, and like you said, it primes you. So yeah, it'd be really interesting to hear how that kind of relates to things, and if you do release research, be very interesting to hear about that. Indeed. So I think if people wanted to find out more about you, Bryce, where would they be best kind of finding your stuff? I know I follow you on Instagram, and I know obviously your website is a great place for people to go.
Absolutely. So those are the two biggest ways. On our website, www.thestrengthathlete.com, there's a contact page there. You can send us an email. You can also flip through some of the information there, and some of the freebies that are there. There's a strength training program and a temp selection sheet. And then Instagram is where I post most everything else. So the two of those places are, for now, where I've kind of keeping my training.
Brilliant. And you've got your own podcast as well, so people can, if they like listening to you here, they can go and head over there as well.
Yeah, we just started a podcast early this year, and it's a combination of bringing guests on and then talking about strength and training and conditioning topics. So it runs the spectrum of things, but yeah, it's just been a ton of fun for us.
Awesome. No, it's brilliant, and I'll put all of that information in the description box below, so people can then get hold of that. And I just want to thank you big time for coming onto the podcast. I know the audience will really take away a lot of value from this. So yeah, thank you a lot, Bryce.
Steve, it's been a pleasure, man.
Cheers, and thanks everyone for listening. Talk to you soon.